Hello and welcome to Freelancing for Journalists.
I'm Emma Wilkinson.
And I'm Lily Cantor.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Series 11. We've got another corker of an episode today. You know the format by now. Each week we discuss an issue affecting freelance journalists and chat through the problems and solutions with the help of two experienced guests. This series we're also on YouTube for a bit of an experiment. So we're attempting to look vaguely presentable for the record. I wouldn't say we always look this presentable, but maybe that's just me.
Speak for yourself. Well, and that's a very good segue to this week's topic because we're actually thinking about rethinking social media. So Emma and I have been discussing recently really whether we need to go back to the drawing board when it comes to social media and how we use it. And of course, this all sort of stems back to a certain tech person buying a certain bird-themed app, which we will get to in a minute.
Yeah, so before we open that can of worms, let's have a positive start, Lily, by talking about our freelance win of the week. You go first.
Well, mine's a bit of a double-edged sword. So I mentioned previously I was meant to be going on a press trip next week, and that was one of my little highlights. I've now had to cancel that because I've got COVID. And the thought of running around Lake Garda, which was a very attractive thought, is now kind of the last thing I want to be doing when I can hardly breathe. So I've had to cancel that. But what I have got lined up instead, not till 2025, but I managed to get myself a press place on a race in Rwanda, which I'm very excited about. So that's definitely my win of the week. How about you?
That is quite the press trip. Let's hope that you're not jinxing all these press trips by mentioning them as your highlight of the week on the podcast. Like maybe you should just be keeping quiet now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so mine it's nowhere near as exciting as that. But I got a very last minute commission, but it was for a really straightforward news story, that kind of thing that you can just do in your sleep. It had all the information and comment from organizations that I needed. So it took no time at all. So it was just a little bit of extra spending money. It all went very smoothly. I did it in about an hour. I was like, great,
You
perfect.
always
Send
seem
me
to be
more of
getting
those.
those. You're always getting those. You're an ace at those quick wins.
It's who you know, not what you know, Lily.
Yeah. Okay, it's time to introduce our guest then. So first up, we've got Stephen Asarch, a freelance tech writer based in New York. He's written for Insider, Newsweek, Inverse, and many more.
We also have with us Chris Stokel-Walker, who seems to be our FFJ go-to tech expert. He writes for pretty much everyone, including the New York Times, Wired, and The Economist. And he's the author of 3 books about the digital world, including TikTok Boom.
Okay, so Stephen, hi, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
Let's come to you first then. So as a tech journalist, can you tell us a bit more about how you use social media and which apps you sort of personally find useful for your work?
Sure. So I used to be a big Twitter guy. I think as a journalist, it's the best way to reach sources, find the people you need, and broadcast that you've written a story at all. In the current days, where Twitter has sort of changed and become X, it's less important. I mean, it's better for my mental health because I spend less time binging on the app, but it's still an incredibly important place to be and a place that you need to really like, at least for now, show up and, use to the best of your ability. I've moved a lot of my time over to Reddit and Discord, which I don't know if they count as social medias in the same way that a Twitter or a Facebook does. But I think they're a great way to really dissect the information you need, break it apart, and get it out to a much, niche specific audience. Um, I'll pop onto LinkedIn on occasion to see if it's still, working. But those are still the platforms that I spend the most time on and think they're the most important.
It's interesting that you mentioned Reddit there, because I've not made much use of it, but in terms of the field that I write about and kind of medicine and health, there are some quite useful forums on there for finding stories. I can see Chris nodding his head there. So let's ask you the same question really. You know, what social media do you make use of, and has that changed in the past sort of 12 months? Have you experimented with some of those new kids on the block like Threads or Mastodon?
Yeah, I have Threads and I have Mastodon on my phone and on my iPad, but I don't really open them. And I think that's just because there's only so many hours in the day, and you can't be bothered to try and search through all of these ones. And often the conversations are repeated. It's interesting, obviously. Stephen mentions Reddit. That is a really good example. And as you say, Emma, junior doctors forums, they're really active on Reddit in terms of subreddits there. And I did a story just recently for Vice, which was looking at people who have been kind of banned across lots of different dating apps, where I found the case studies through Reddit. That's, I guess, been somewhere that journalists have traditionally looked, particularly in kind of our beats that we're looking at, me and Stephen in particular, on kind of internet culture and so on. Interestingly, I had a conversation with Raman Chowdhury, who used to work at Twitter, then left, and did a podcast interview with her yesterday where she apologized for not ever getting back to my DMs because she no longer checks Twitter. And she said, "You've got to come onto LinkedIn. We've got to connect there." And I was like, isn't LinkedIn just that terrible place that like nobody goes to and is full of like business bros talking about their kids and then turning that into some sort of like business maxim? And she said, no, it's changing. So I will dip my toe back in the water, I think, of LinkedIn. But yeah, I'm still clinging desperately onto the sinking ship that is Twitter, and I refuse to call it X, just because basically that's how I've built my career in terms of finding people on there and the immediacy of it. And I really don't want to lose that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been looking for a case study today, and I tried lots of other ways. I'd contacted organisations directly. I'd used Facebook, hadn't been able to find anyone. And I went on to Twitter, and within minutes I had loads of people contacting me, and I was like, oh damn it, it's still working just about. But it obviously has changed, and the functionality of it has seems to have got worse recently. Stephen, just wanted to ask you about this really, because it's more difficult for people to see your stuff, and it seems to be things are not appearing on your timeline that were before. But admittedly, neither Emma or I are prepared to pay for Twitter, or to call it X. So I just wonder, should we be paying for it? And should we, or at the same time, if we're not willing to pay for it, is it a bad thing that we've sort of become reliant on this one platform?
Sure. I refuse to pay for X. I think it's weird. I think the actual stuff that you get out of it isn't worth it unless you want to turn, go alt-right, as some media people do, and just farm engagement and clicks for money, because that seems to be a new business model. I even know a few journalists who, get Twitter Blue and turn the little blue check mark off because it looks bad and it's kind of embarrassing to have. I think the fact that journalism in general, because by the time I jumped on, about 7 or 8 years ago, Twitter was the main journalism hub. So I didn't really get a say in making the journalist part of Twitter. But I think the fact that we put all of our eggs in one basket was kind of bad, and has kind of forced us to scurry like cockroaches in the light to find a new place that seems slightly better. But because social media platforms, by their definition, are like kind of they get shaped by the people in charge, and when those people change, it kind of messes with the whole system, the ecosystem that has been so carefully curated. So, and we're dealing with, having to deal with the community guidelines problems and the terms of service issues that are constantly changing on each social media platform. Twitter was so good because it was a place that we could go to talk about these niche issues without having it a giant megahorn to every single person on the planet in the same way that a story virally can. It was a way for us to communicate in a much smaller niche that could reach a larger audience. But now, because of the ways Twitter has changed and the fact that we can't DM certain people unless we have blue, or how we get tweet ratioed, not like actual Twitter ratio. I mean, like the amount of tweets we can post. It's changed so much, and it's definitely something that I've noticed in my day-to-day reporting, that I still have to use Twitter, and it kind of messes with the flow. But because of the way everything's changed, we're sort of stuck with it, and I wish there was a better alternative, but I don't see that coming anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I find the DM situation to be a real problem now. Like, I'm constantly saying, can you please follow me? I need to, because it's just that speed of being able to get in touch with someone. You can send emails, but they just get lost. And it just seemed, if you knew someone was active, you could see they were posting and they were there. It's such a quick way to get in touch with people. And if I'm doing a news shift and I want to speak to GPs, and I know I can see that they're on there, so I know they're active. If I send them an email, I don't get a response. So it's just so useful. It's very annoying. But one of the arguments that you hear, Chris, is that, and that some journalists have made, is that you pay for other services. I pay for, Otter to do transcripts. So there's loads of things that I pay for as a journalist, and it's tax deductible. Are we all being a bit too stubborn in not wanting to give our money to Twitter? Because would it make our lives easier, I guess, is my question. Being like, I'm not going to do it. I just can't bring myself. But is that far too stubborn? Am I cutting off my nose to spite my face?
I guess you might be, although I'm also the same in that I just refuse, because Elon Musk is just such a terrible person, and I don't want to validate what he's doing with Twitter by giving money. Although, weirdly, I had to spend £28 on his biography by Walter Isaacson, which was a ridiculous amount of money. But then I'm also going to expense that to the publication that I ended up doing the story based on it for. I get the point of kind of using it as a paid for tool, and I do see the utility. I had literally overnight an issue like yours, Emma, in terms of the DM thing, where I got in touch with someone. I said, can you DM me? I kind of forgot, as I've been using as the stock phrase, can you follow, then DM me, for the last couple of weeks. Forgot to put the follow in, and so they couldn't DM me for a while. I got an email overnight, which I would have checked if it had been an actual DM, because it would have been on my phone, but instead I don't have push notifications on my email, so I didn't look at it overnight. And so I missed the chance to talk to this person before the deadline that I had for a story, just simply because of Elon Musk. And it's kind of that friction, I suppose, that is a real issue. I mean, I still think that there are ways around it. Just simply having to talk people through it. And I think, my memory gets worse and worse over time. But, there was a period where you couldn't DM people unless you followed each other. So, we're kind of reverting back to that a little bit. I guess the concern for me, and it's one that Stephen touched on a little bit there, is we long advise like digital creators, YouTubers and TikTokers and others to like not build their businesses on quicksand, because there's always the risk that if you're on a private platform, they can pull the rug out. And God knows I've written so many of those stories in the past. Yet not following that own advice. But it's more a concern for me, I think, less about the payment stuff and more about the dwindling number of users. There comes a point, I think, when what Elon Musk called a de facto public square before he bought it doesn't become that anymore. It kind of becomes a self-selecting niche of people, as Stephen said, like alt-right wannabes or something like that, and then that loses its utility as kind of like a virtual vox popping space, which is where suddenly that becomes a problem. I don't think we're at that extinction event yet, but that's always the fear, that actually maybe the ground is slipping a little bit underneath us constantly as we go, and we won't realize that it's actually at that terminal point until it's too late.
So what do we do? I mean, Stephen, if it is all slipping away, as freelance journalists, should we be trying harder on other platforms, or should we, just kind of stick with it and just hope for the best?
Sure. I wish I had a better answer, other than stick it out, maybe. I think when it comes to like my work, I'm very focused on the digital culture space and talking and finding influencers. And as Chris said, influencers, it's important to diversify your portfolio and not necessarily stick on just one platform, or else you're going to get screwed over by the hierarchy in charge. I think we're going to see a lot more the newsletters and the Substacks and people creating their own little communities because the internet has basically devolved into its own little communities. You know, the internet used to be a near infinite amount of websites talking about anything imaginable. Now it's become 4 social media platforms that you check every day, and that's all you can basically do. So it's just going to become more and more and more niche and focusing more and more on smaller communities. So I think as time goes on, we're going to see journalists have to find ways to reach the people that care about their work and want to focus on their work through these more smaller, specific platforms. I think right now we're kind of still stuck with Twitter or X. It always depends on my editor if I get to call it Twitter or X. I usually just throw a question mark in there to see who will catch it. But I think we're just going to have to be stuck with Twitter for now until a better alternative comes out. Because I've tried Threads. It was just full of ads for Burger King. So I stopped using it almost immediately. And I'm still not on Blue Sky. So if you have an invite, let me know. But I think we're just going to stick with Twitter for now until a better alternative shows up, or we're just going to keep creating our smaller and smaller communities until all we're just talking to is each other in an echo chamber.
Yeah, I think mostly it's very egotistical of me, but I'm just really angry that I don't get the engagement that I used to. So if I'm posting a story I've done, it just doesn't, you just don't. You kind of half the time you're going, hello, can anybody actually see me on the, I'm here? Because I'd spent so long getting that blue tick. I'd spent so long building that community. It just feels like a waste of time. You mentioned Threads there, Stephen, and Chris, I'm going to come to you about that because I've been really trying with Threads. I had high hopes for Threads. It felt like it looked the most like Twitter. It was kind of more intuitive to kind of, oh, the lights have gone out on me. More intuitive to kind of use. Oh, but I'm really struggling with it because the functionality isn't there. And I just think, and I'm just not seeing much. Do we just need to be patient, Chris? Is it gonna come? Like Twitter took a while to build, right?
It did, but I guess Twitter took a while to build in a really unique set of circumstances and that kind of previous era that Stephen was talking about where like the web was much more weird and sprawling. It's actually really interesting because I've been I've been looking back at bits of this for a book that I've done on the history of the internet, and like, you know, Twitter kind of spread through lots of weird, unique circumstances that are specific to its growth. So it got used at South by Southwest, early on in its growth, and became kind of adopted by tech adherents there, and then had things like, you know, the plane landing on the Hudson River, the sort of the actual real life news event that inspired the movie Sully, and then it had Osama bin Laden dying, and these kind of news events where people congregated around it and used it in a way that really shaped its kind of value for journalism. And Threads will struggle with that, I think, in part because Twitter is still around. It's, you know, better still, despite many of the issues. But there's also this kind of like weird stink with it, which is it's connected to Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. It has that link to Mark Zuckerberg. We've come through the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we're all a little bit skeptic around tech. And actually, if we're talking about the risks of putting all your eggs in one basket and backing Elon Musk as kind of like the person that's going to maintain and curate and keep alive the platform that we use day in, day out in journalism, there's this whole other issue where do you really trust Meta to do the same thing? They're profit driven. They have these kind of sometimes questionable ideas, and we've seen in recent months them withdrawing money from local news initiatives. And so actually, I guess the question is, even if Threads were to become popular, and the suggestions that they just put out like a half-baked product, it's kind of got that stench of failure a little bit already, in the same way that actually kind of 15 years ago Bing did as a search engine compared to Google, although that's kind of come back a little bit thanks to ChatGPT. There's that question of, even if they could get rid of that kind of sense of failure, if we would want to leap in headlong to do this, because I think there are real issues there.
Yeah, and I think data is something we wanted to come on to, because obviously when we're deciding as journalists which of these platforms we want to use, should we be thinking more about how our data and our information is going to be used, and what's going to happen when we send information in a DM, like who is actually seeing that? I mean, Stephen, is this something you think that perhaps we need to be thinking more carefully about, particularly as journalists?
Yeah, it's absolutely something I think about when I'm doing a sensitive story about an internet sex pest or a company doing some shady stuff. I don't want other people in the pot reading this stuff. I don't like using Twitter DMs for this sensitive information. I do have a Signal. I do use that as much as I can to try and get people in a safer space to open up. But I often deal with digital culture influencers who don't really understand the ramifications of the things they say or do. So they will just dump valuable information in a Twitter DM and like dox a person's number who may not necessarily want to know. And I don't know who's looking at that, but I can't just be like, hey, can you take that back and like post it on a more secure platform? But when I'm working at it, I always try to bring people into a more secure platform, but sometimes you don't have a say on the matter. I think as journalists in this new, because we're the first generation of these internet tech journalists, and I assume everyone is reading my data at all time. If I say that I want a corn dog, I'm going to get an ad on Instacart saying, hey, why don't you add corn dogs to your cart? Like, the phone is listening at all times. So our data is basically just being shuffled around to who knows who. And as journalists, the data we have is very sensitive. So trying to find that middle ground between being able to be open and approachable while also still being able to secure the information you have and not letting it into the evil hands of the Musk fanboys is definitely something that you have to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, I use Signal sometimes, and that can go one of two ways, right? You either reassure someone that you're taking this seriously, or they immediately panic about what's this app that that I've never heard of. But I suppose that's your job as a journalist to talk them through that. I mean, Chris, TikTok's another one. Is it possible to use social media in an ethically conscious way? This is like, I feel like there's no good options.
No, there's not. And I think, with TikTok, there are their own issues around that. Not least, we've seen the surveillance of some actual journalists using the app, including Christina Criddle from the Financial Times, who I did a podcast interview with her for Article 19, which is a non-profit based on kind of freedom of speech, human rights organization. And she talked through how essentially what TikTok claims were rogue employees who have subsequently been sacked from their job had used their knowledge of her username and who she was in touch with to try and out sources that she had within the company. They didn't succeed as far as she knows, but it was really a warning. And I think this is particularly of issue if you're covering tech companies, because you end up invariably kind of using the platforms that you're writing about to try and find the people who work for the businesses that you're writing about as well. But it is a concern, I think, for all tech platforms. I'm doing a story today for Fast Company about how Google has inadvertently been leaking chat histories with Google Bard. It's kind of AI, chat GPT alike into search results. And there's this kind of weird issue where we're almost in trouble whichever way we go because of the way that this is all so intertwined. And Signal so far seems to be kind of the one saving grace. But as you say, Emma, and we've discussed this before at conferences and things like that, that it does put some people off where they go, what is generally maybe like a bit of innocuous whistleblowing. I say that as if that's possible. It's a contradiction in terms, I suppose, but something that's not a huge deal, but is requiring privacy in some way and some element of source protection. Suddenly people feel, I don't know, as if they're like deep throating Watergate or something like that. It kind of amps up, I think, the worries here. So yeah, it's difficult to say, and probably won't get onto this, but it becomes harder with upcoming legislation in the UK. The Online Safety Bill wants to kind of make journalists' job harder by removing the ability to have end-to-end encryption. So essentially, the possibility of your message never being tapped into by authorities currently exists, but politicians in the UK and potentially elsewhere, I suppose, might want to try and end that, and that has real ramifications for how we do our jobs.
And Chris, while we've got you here as the expert on TikTok, how is that working is it working for journalists? Is it, because Lily and I tried it for a bit and then immediately gave up, it hurt our brains. I think maybe we're just too old, but maybe we're missing a trick here. Does it have a usefulness there for a working journalist?
I think it can. I think it can. You can source people for one thing. You can tap into kind of conversations, admittedly through video, that are happening in disparate sub-communities. That can be really useful. So you could look into the world of medicine for Stephen. It's kind of self-evident that the creators that he covers will already be on there. And it is useful not just as kind of sourcing potential interviewees and finding ideas for stories, but also for disseminating content. One of the people that does pretty well on that is Taylor Lorenz, who will basically repackage bits of her written stories into kind of first person pieces to camera, as we would describe, I guess, in traditional journalism, little bits of discussive narrative that describes a story and what it is. We've got also Sophia Smith-Gaylor, who used to work at Vice, recently went freelance, who is doing this stuff. One person that's really, really good, I think, is a friend of FFJ, is Laura Garcia, who works for BBC Mundo, has a kind of version of this. So there are opportunities along the journalism pipeline, from sourcing stories, sourcing interviewees, and then actually the bit after you've produced the journalism, disseminating it and broadcasting it to an audience. That does work, but it is an additional thing that journalists have to do. And you have to be comfortable in front of camera. You have to then learn the kind of formats and the memes and the general kind of tone of TikTok, which is in itself a big time sink. So, I don't blame people for not doing it. I dipped in to try and publicize my book on TikTok on it, and then haven't really posted anything since.
Yeah, I think it, like you say, it's one of those things that if you do it, you can get it really right, but it does seem to be so time consuming, and actually, is your time better spent elsewhere? And I think that's something that is, through freelancers, we need to think about kind of where we're spending our time online and the different platforms, and our niches as well. Like I use Instagram specifically for my journalism around running and fitness, because it's quite a visual thing and it works well. But Emma wouldn't do that for medicine. She'll use it just for personal. So again, it kind of comes back to kind of what you're doing. You've both mentioned Reddit as well, and I wonder, Stephen, if we bring you back in again, like, how do you think journalists kind of should decide like which platforms they're going to spend their time on, whether that's for sourcing stories or kind of promoting what they're doing?
I think the first thing you really should keep in mind is, do you want to be an influencer, or do you want to just be a journalist? I think in today's day and age, in order to have that audience and be able to curate that community I was talking about before, you kind of have to be an online personality. posting videos on TikTok, reels on Instagram, YouTube shorts. Video is where a lot of people's eyes are on these days, but the written word is still, to me, more interesting and impactful. I don't want to be an influencer. I cover them, and the idea of being one of them fills me with fear and horror. So I'd like to be able to just stick with the written word and let that be my, guiding light. But I think in today's day and age, being an influencer is what you really want to be. So finding the social media platform that fits for you is mainly just trying a bunch of them and seeing which one sticks. I think the algorithms dictate a lot of what happens on these apps. So figuring out how that algorithm works is super impactful and helpful when it comes to trying to figure that out. Um, I don't want to be stuck on Twitter. I'd love to be able to soar my wings on a space where I'm not going to get death threats for daring to call Daddy Musk a no-no word. But that only comes with time and effort. So finding the social media platform that works for you is just trial and error and figuring out how internet addicted / famous you want to be.
Yeah, and I think basically you have to be strategic, right? You can't do everything. I mean, Chris, you both mentioned LinkedIn actually before, and that's one that I really struggle with because we have dipped in and out of LinkedIn so many times, and part of me just thinks, oh, maybe I just need to put a bit more effort into it, but I just don't see that there's any return there. So it is about being strategic, I think. Chris, I've got 2 questions. Have you got any more tips about how to be strategic, about which you use? But also, can you be a journalist and have no social media presence?
I think so. On the latter, yeah, probably you can get away with it, but it makes everything so much harder. Like I teach undergraduates and postgraduates as part of my job alongside doing the freelance stuff, and there are some who, these are kind of Gen Z kids who are, some of them are completely addicted to social media and they have all sorts of platforms, and some of them have been smart and realized the mistakes of us millennials who have made issues and problems with being on social media, and they've kind of said, well, actually, no, I kind of want to stay away from that. But it is, I think, a vital place still for not just finding stories, but also for finding your network and kind of building connections in that way. And I think that's kind of really vital. But as this sort of becomes more fragmented, you're right, we need to be smarter in how we work rather than harder. And I think it doesn't harm to think about it maybe more not by a platform by platform basis, but more by like a medium by medium basis. So instead of some of the sort of concepts and some of the ways of presentation can be shared across different platforms. LinkedIn, though I'm not expert at it, has hashtags, for instance, that you can use and tap into in the same way that Twitter does, and obviously Instagram has that as well. And Threads is sort of half getting there at some point, we believe. Blue Sky, Mastodon, they kind of can have the opportunity of tying in those things. And the students that I teach, I increasingly say, well, you have to kind of be comfortable not just telling a story in words as much as we might want to. You have to then bear in mind that you might get asked on a podcast afterwards to try and recontextualize that story, or to go on TV to explain it, or to go on radio and to be able to actually distill a 600-word story into kind of a 2-minute conversation, a 2-way discussion with the presenter where they ask you 4 or 5 questions and you manage to hit the mark while getting across the information to a more generalized audience, is a really valuable skill, because the kind of the process of journalism just seems to be flattening and spreading out. So it's I think maybe it's less about focusing on specific platforms and learning about kind of the generalized skills, not least because we don't know what's coming next, frankly. If we'd had this conversation 4 years ago, TikTok probably wouldn't have been in the debate, and yet it suddenly is. And Twitter would have been right at the tip of our tongues because it was dominant, and now it seems to be a little bit on the wane. So, these things move very, very quickly, and I think it's about kind of the core competencies more than anything else.
Yeah, and you're right. We never know what's around the corner. And like the other day, like Snapchat was in the news, and I was like, Snapchat? Are people still using Snapchat? And there is certain people that still, maybe certain age groups, that are still using things like Snapchat and other platforms. So yeah, it's always evolving. So yeah, I guess it's just like you say, trying to keep our skills up to date as much as possible. But yeah, it's very, very tricky. Well, both of you, thank you so much, because it's been really fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk about this all day. But you've both of you given lots of food for thought, and lots of different platforms that you've mentioned that we'll put in the show notes, as well as a few people you've mentioned on TikTok. We'll dig them out and add them to our show note resources as well. But just before we sign off, we're going to ask you both for a recommendation for a piece of work by a freelance journalist. So Stephen, let's come to you first. What's your recommendation?
Sure. So Longreads has basically become my site that I'm obsessed with, that I try to read as much as I can, because they put out really good work. And they put out something last month by Seth Simons, who does the humorist, called Who's Afraid of Lorne Michaels, which basically just talks about how the guy who's done SNL for the past 50 years is kind of influenced a lot of Hollywood culture and media, while SNL has also had an incredibly toxic workplace. So I've always loved comedy. I got my start in stand-up. So coming to the realization that Lorne is kind of the one who's shaped a lot of the weird humor we've seen today was definitely an interesting read.
Fantastic recommendation, thank you. And we have a podcast episode on long reads in this series, so it's all very full circle and tying in very nicely. And Chris, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, mine was initially going to be a story by Miles Klee, but then I realized that he got a job, which is good. He's a really interesting internet culture writer. So I'm a huge fan of Jessica Lucas, who is a UK-based journalist who covers a lot of kind of internet culture stuff. And she kind of she's kind of like, I guess, a deep cover submarine sometimes, in that she'll go silent for several weeks and then just pop up and produce these absolutely incredible stories that are sort of sourced from and about sort of social media, and like really utilize very intelligently different platforms to find not just stories but interviewees. And actually she has her Twitter, her Reddit username in her Twitter profile, which I think is quite smart and shows how valuable she finds that. Mine is from kind of a few months ago, but she did an amazing story on an issue around TikTok where users were kind of being encouraged to drink to excess on live streams. And it's kind of a weird intersection of like the online world and the offline world and health all coming together, and showing how, like, sometimes there's a lot of friction around these things. And it's just really, really powerful. It's published on the Huffington Post, and just really, really worth anybody's time to read.
Thanks, Chris. That's fantastic. We will put the link to both those articles as well in our show notes, so listeners can go away and have a read for themselves. It's time to bring this episode to a close. Thank you again, both Stephen and Chris. Fantastic advice. Very sensible, and actually what I thought could be a very depressing topic is it's all fine. It's fine. I'm fine with it. It's okay.
We'll just carry on regardless. So if you'd like any more tips on how to develop a successful career, then sign up to our newsletter on Substack, which I suppose you could also sort of call a social media now that it's got its notes. But don't worry, we won't be sending you notes. It's just a weekly newsletter. And on there, we share tips and personal experience.
You can also join our Facebook community. We didn't really mention Facebook. We have a very large Facebook community. There's like 7,000 members in there now. If you've got any questions about freelancing, you can ask and get some very experienced journalists giving you quick answers. We are on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. We're going to call it Twitter forever. We're at Freelancing4, and I'm on there as at Emma Journo.
And I'm at Lily Cantor. And finally, a big thank you to our producer, Maddie Drury.
Yep, and we'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Goodbye.